All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for. I was playing a little bit of a new option for this streaming platform, so I'm glad you came in for a little bit of the music as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books, St. Charles City County Library, and Sisters in Crime St. Louis welcome former Missouri journalist and author Jo Allison, who will discuss her new book, Storied and Scandalous St. Louis, a history of breweries, baseball, prejudice, and protest. Tonight, Allison will be in conversation with the president of Sisters in Crime St. Louis chapter, Fedora Amis. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Jo and Fedora, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place, and also sometimes just to have some fun. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for your friends on our website, left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating. So I thank you so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, so you can type your questions as a comment at any point in time as it comes to your mind. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on YouTube and Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. And now, about tonight's book, Storied and Scandalous St. Louis. In the years from its founding in 1764 to the mid-20th century, St. Louis saw more than its share of shady, sad, storied, and scandalous citizens. They weren't married when they should have been, or were married to too many at once. They carried notions of honor too far, or lacked honor at all in their dealings in matters of race, class, immigration, gender, and good government. They faced nature's fury, from tornadoes to exploding sewers, and managed to play politics with all of it. In between, they offered moments of glory. In short, the very human St. Louisans of the past gave us good tales for the retelling, the better that they're true. And now, about tonight's speakers. Jo Allison, the pen name of Linda Dodkins, spent 10 years as a journalist, mostly for newspapers. She was the first woman to do television news in her hometown of Joplin, Missouri. Although she went on to teaching and researching, she believes reporting was the best education she could have had. She now lives in Bristol, Virginia, and more information is available on her website, joallisonauthor.com. As well as having available Storied and Scandalous St. Louis, we also have her mystery series, the first book in the series, Good Old Summertime, available. Tonight, Jo will be in conversation with Fedora Amis. Fedora won the Mayhaven Fiction Prize for her Victorian whodunit, Jack the Ripper in St. Louis. 5-star Cengage published her next two Jemmy McBustle mysteries, Mayhem at Buffalo Bill's Wild West, and Have Your Ticket Punched by Frank James. She has one son, Skimmer, who partners Fedora in writing fiction, fantasy, writing science fiction, fantasy, and magical realism. Why do I write? I love words, always have. Reading them, writing them. I even like looking them up in the dictionary. So call me eccentric, call me crazy, but call me a writer. Fantastic words from Fedora. And now, I am so happy and proud to welcome our guest for the evening on behalf of Left Bank Books, St. Charles City County Library, and the Sisters in Crime St. Louis chapter. If everyone would please help me in warmly welcoming Fedora Amis and Jo Allison for Left Bank Books. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
You know, I absolutely have to give a shout out to St. Charles City County Library. I've been to their wonderful book fairs and hope that they have many more in the future once we get past this COVID thing. And also a shout out to the Junior League of St. Charles County. I'm going to speak there in costume in May. It was supposed to be a week ago last night, but that was pushed forward to May. So I am waiting. I am hoping that we will have it in May. Delighted, delighted. And now, Joe, it's great to see you again. Oh my
Yes,
goodness,
indeed.
it
Indeed.
has been a little while. And your book, I just finished reading it. It's delightful.
Good.
Scandals. St. Louis has scandals galore. I mean, more scandals than you could possibly write about, I'm sure. And
Absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
had
My
only,
editors were saying that a good deal when I was, at 20-25% over the word count. I said, "Oh, no more scandals." So absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
that was only the first 200 years. So we've got a
That's
whole bunch
right. I
more to
mean,
go.
you
You've
know,
got material for several more books there, I bet. But
absolutely.
scandals, what do you mean by scandal? And why did you pick the ones you picked?
You know, the Globe Pequot has a whole series of these books out, Storied and Scandalous, fill in the name of the city. And it's really interesting because everyone who writes one of these books has a slightly different definition of what's scandalous, if not storied. The man who wrote one about Portland, Oregon, decided it would only be about gambling. That was the only scandal he wanted to talk about. Carla Deal has written a great book about storied and scandalous Kansas City, but it's Kansas City, so every other page has to talk about the Pendergasts. She has, that's the historical fact. So I started out writing, and the first thing that I wrote for them to even look at to see if they were interested involved what's actually the plot of one of my fiction novels, which has to do with ragtime and race. And that story of Tom Turpin and Scott Joplin and all of those people is told in Storied and Scandalous. But I think people would say, well, what's scandalous about that? First of all, ragtime was scandalous at the time, okay? Not only in the white community, but for most of the Black community. Okay. And on top of that, the only place you could listen to this wonderful music that became the basis for jazz, rock, rap, all of that music, okay, was in bars and brothels. Okay. And I thought, okay, why is that a scandal? And I decided it's because there's an injustice involved. And some of these things, I mean, like, what was scandalous about old St. Louis baseball? I mean, okay, people started drinking at the games, unthinkable at the time. Beer at a baseball game? I mean, who'd heard of such a thing? And that doesn't strike us as scandalous today. Those stories are as funny as they are scandalous. But many of the other stories really involve a sense of injustice to one group or another. And that's part of the title of the book. So there you go. Scandalous stuff.
Wonderful. Well, I have something that I'd like to add on to your story about Scott Joplin because he was a very interesting person, and Missouri gave him his launch. He was from Texarkana and was in his teens a wonderful musician. He traveled all around. He had a band in Chicago. So why did he come to Missouri? He came to Missouri in order to learn musical notation so that he could write down his compositions and actually make some money off of them. He went to the George R. Smith College for Negroes in Sedalia, Missouri.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he made his living by playing piano in a saloon called the Maple Leaf Club over Blocker's Feet store in Sedalia, Missouri.
Yep.
And also there,
Hence the Maple Leaf rag.
That's right. It sold 10 million. It sold 500,000 copies in the next 10 years, and it's still been a really great seller. Well, that's where he found a man, a music store owner named John Stark, who started a publishing company just to publish Joplin's music.
Absolutely.
But how does that get to be a scandal? Well, he came to St. Louis and fortunately got out of the other side of things, which went very much downhill. Sedalia was really progressive, but in 1925, they burned down George R. Smith College, and at the same time, they burned down the county courthouse. There was a great deal of lawlessness, and I call that a scandal.
Right, and And there is, echoes of that. I mean, of things that today we have trouble sort of getting our head around some of the things that are scandalous. And yet I think some of the stories very much remind us of things that are going on right now. I mean, there is that thread that runs through the scandals as well. So I think the book has a mix of things. I think there are some things that are fun. I mean, people hear the word storied and scandalous, and someone says, "Oh, it's just a bunch of downers of everything that went wrong." But I think some of it is actually uplifting. One of my favorite stories, which comes from some of my academic work, actually, is about what women did when they got the vote. I can see most of what you're wearing there. It looks like it might say "Votes for Women." Yeah.
Yes, this is the story
What
behind it.
women did when they got the vote in 1920. I mean, there was a scandal going on, and they attacked it. I mean, that's
Literally,
great.
physically.
That's wonderful. That's a great story. And then there's some of the baseball stories, which I just think are the most fun. But I have to tell you that I have a prejudice for both the baseball and the music. Um, when I was growing up, and I didn't realize this for a long time, but when I look back on it, and I have an admission to make here, I did listen to Cardinals baseball, but I was also a Yankees fan, and I know in some circles that's not the right thing to say, but it's because Mickey Mantle was from very close to my hometown of Joplin. In fact, he owned the Holiday Inn and spent his off season possibly in the bar. But at any rate, speaking of scandals, but so growing up, my father expected many things of me, but one of the things he expected was for me to always know which way the outfield was going to shift depending on whether the Mick was batting right or left. Okay, I mean, at that level, I had to understand baseball to for my father to be fully appreciative of me. My mother's goal, on the other hand, was that I be able to play the maple leaf rag. Maybe not well, probably not as fast as she did, but nevertheless, the music was critical. And so when I started to write these things, I knew certainly I had to write about baseball and music, baseball and ragtime. So those are in there, along with many other things. Other books in the series don't always have environmental issues. And you would think, where's the scandal in a tornado? I mean, it would look like a pretty equal opportunity, sort of thing that happens, act of God. But as a matter of fact, it was the response to a really bad tornado in 1896 that ripped through Soulard. It did minor damage in the central West End, where Left Bank Books is. And a lot of money was raised, and it all went to fix the very minor damage in the central West End. And when the people in the German Soulard neighborhood said, we need some of that money, we don't, our streets are, I mean, it was just a screaming disaster. I mean, you see the pictures and buildings exploding, and all of the dead were in Soulard. And when they asked for some of that money, they were told, self-reliance is a virtue. So there's a scandal, and you don't expect to see that coming out of environmental issues, including exploding sewers and all the other things that went on that are detailed in the book.
Go back to music for a moment and talk about my favorite one, which came out of St. Louis, Staggerly. Can you tell us about that? That's fun.
That is part of a certain genre of music. Okay, and I mentioned that one along with the whole Frankie and Johnny story, which of course I remember hearing that growing up, and I'm trying to think which singer. I mean, it's been done all over the place. There's what, 3 or 4 Frankie and Johnny movies, but those all come out of a tradition, okay, that helped define that part of St. Louis. Okay, the part down around Union Station, the part that was where nice people didn't go, also where careful people didn't go. And it helped add to that feeling that ragtime must be scandalous in lots of ways. Okay. And I think this is really a point worth making. As I say, I have a novel out there about this, but But the fact is that a good part of the Black community did not approve of ragtime because of things like the Frankie and Johnny store. I mean, it just had set up this whole negative vibe. And during the World's Fair, a lot of groups decided that they would have their um, national conventions or whatever kind of meeting they were going to have in St. Louis to piggyback on the fair. And there was a group called the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, I believe was the name of it. And they wrote to the director of the fair and said, "We will only come to St. Louis if you promise us there will be no ragtime played at the fair or anywhere near it." Yeah. And I'm sure someone agreed to that. And as a matter of fact, there was no ragtime technically played on the fairgrounds, but on the, one street over, there was a heck of a business going on in ragtime because people loved the music. And as a matter of fact, of course, the fair was why Scott Joplin wrote the Cascades, why Tom Turpin wrote the St. Louis Rag. And what was that wonderful song title? One of the greats wrote something called Funny Folks. Okay. And that was about all the foreigners at the fair. So there's a whole ragtime, vibe going on around even the 1904 World's Fair. But interesting times. The whole fair, that takes up a lot of pages. Okay? And I think it's always fair to say that a lot of good things happened. I mean, there are, for St. Louis, it helped put the city on the map. It got a lot of civic improvements done that wouldn't have been done otherwise. It introduced a lot of very notable things, but then there were just instances that make us cringe today, including one. I was doing a radio interview, and Julie Buck got interested in this one. She said, "Wait a minute, what's this about? Preemies and incubators." And yes, indeed, Preemies and Incubators were part of a sideshow. It was such a new thing. And that might have been one thing, it had been done other places, but the problem was St. Louis didn't hire the right doctors. They didn't hire a doctor that knew how the incubators worked. And it's one of the saddest stories to come out of the fair, the number of children that did not survive, because they were on display. At the fair.
You mentioned that you had a radio interview. Is that archived anywhere that we could hear it?
I don't know that one is. I don't know that either one of them are. I haven't tried to go look. I do have, there's some podcasts out there and some other good stuff. And maybe I could, I'll see if I can find that. I'll see if I can find that while we're talking and throw it in the chat box. But it was a lot of fun to be able to talk with people on KTRS. It was
well, let's talk about women.
Little things, but fun.
That's a subject I think we probably both know a little bit about. What do you think about the 200 years of women in St. Louis up to 1950?
Yes. And by the way, for those of you who are wondering, the book was really supposed to stop in 1950. Okay. And some of the people, I think everyone I talk about toward the end, there's a section on Black lives in St. Louis. And all the people were born before 1950, but some of their stories continue on, like Tina Turner, who is still around. But in fact, I suppose Tina Turner is sort of at one end of the chronological spectrum of stories. And of course, the book starts with the founding mother of the city, Marie-Therese Joto, and her scandalous is too dull a word for her relationship with Pierre Laclede. So that there's a starting point. There were women who were society women who put up with the fact that their husbands, who were fur traders, would have also a Native American wife and a Native American family. There are African American women who were much more likely than African American men, and that was the appropriate term at the time, to try to file lawsuits for their freedom, and in some cases were successful, surprisingly. Um, there's an interesting piece on Eliza Haygood, who was a madam and was such a public benefactor that she was lauded for that, made a lot of money being a madam, particularly during the Civil War, and therefore had a lot of money to give away and was very supportive of churches and other benevolent societies. Okay. So she was an interesting woman. There are other prostitutes who came along who were not quite so benevolent or even legal. And by the way, St. Louis had one of the early experiments in legalizing prostitution, which is probably, it only lasted about 4 years, and you can imagine all the problems that it raised. But nevertheless, that's an interesting civic endeavor. So there are women who really made a difference, okay? Including the group of women who got the vote in 1920 and promptly went after. There was something called the courthouse ring. There was a clerk of court who simply tried to control the court system, and he would nominate judges and put the force of his political machine behind them. And then when those judges were on the bench, the man would manage to step in and suggest sentencing, suggest who was on juries, all sorts of things. And the women of St. Louis did not like that. And between the time when they got the vote in the end of August 1920, which was, by the way, after the primary, they couldn't even vote in the primary election that year. Okay, so they get the vote, and they immediately start a campaign to go after the judicial candidates that this guy was promoting. And it happened that all three of these judges were people whose last name started with K. Okay? And so these women not only suddenly get the vote, are encouraging other women to vote, are explaining how to vote. Okay? It's a scratch ballot. You don't vote for somebody, you scratch out the names of the people you don't want to see elected. It's complicated stuff. They did all this education, and they mounted a campaign called Kill the K's. I mean, really, I mean, that, and banners everywhere, and they're going around standing on street corners talking about how terrible these three judges are, or men who wanted to be judges. I think one of them was up for re-election, and they were successful. They changed the judicial system. You know, when I remember when the second wave of feminism, I'm going to tell my age here if I'm not careful. When the second wave of feminism came along, we used to say, well, women got the vote, but they didn't do anything with it. You know, we're going to do something with it, like that was going to happen. But at any rate, the women in St. Louis proved that wrong. And when I found that, I am a student of St. Louis. I mean, as people have pointed out, I'm from Joplin. I live in Virginia and have lived here a good number of years, but I have been a student of St. Louis for the last 20 years, and I have found all sorts of good things. And when I came upon this story in the Western Historical Manuscript Collection out at UMSL, I thought, oh my gosh, you know, this is a great story about how women, for a little while, for a couple of years, made an incredible difference. And even the newspapers were saying, the Post-Dispatch was saying, it's like a new political day. You know, so there are stories like that about women that I very much enjoy telling.
Well, can I hop in on this one, because it's
Please.
something that's very close to my heart, and I think very important to the entire issue of women voting. In fact, I think it is the most crucial incident which caused it to be possible for women to vote, and it happened right here in St. Louis in 1916. The Democratic Convention was here in St. Louis in 1916. And the women, headed by Edna Gellhorn, who was a dynamo to be sure,
Absolutely.
had an idea for a protest that was not like any other. It was a silent protest.
Mm-hmm.
3,000 women lined Locust Boulevard wearing white clothes and yellow parasols and signs that said, "Votes for women."
Mm-hmm.
And they said nothing at all. Why were they there? because most of the delegates were staying at the Jefferson Hotel, and they would walk from the hotel to the Coliseum, 14 blocks away. And they would wave, wave their hats to people, shake hands along the route. That's all they mostly did walk. But this sort of put a damper on things because the women demanded that the Democratic Party have a plank about women suffrage in their platform. It happened. And in the next 4 years, Woodrow Wilson was president and women got the vote. And it started really right here in St. Louis. It wouldn't have happened, perhaps, except for that brilliant protest. Wonderful thing.
That's a famous event in women getting the vote. Okay?
Absolutely.
Although, of course, Wilson opposed it for a good while, but he came around.
Yeah.
Scandals everywhere.
Well, in 2016, AAUW and the other people who had for more than 100 years been trying to get the women to vote, we had a celebration of that. And here's my sash that says women vote. We went down there and had a little march and got our picture taken. And it was a great day. I'm glad that I can be part of it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So there are, as I say, that's one of the stories that I think is actually sort of fun. It has a somewhat sad ending in that the women who had been in the Equal Suffrage League changed over to being in the League of Women Voters. And as they did the various things they did, and they changed school board elections, they went after a U.S. senator who had opposed them. And as they did, they began to lose members because the judges were Republicans, and so they lost Republican members and so on. And while the League of Women Voters, as we know it today, is a great organization that does great work, they were forced into doing that work, okay, because of the politics that they ran into when they started the Kill the K's campaign. So there's a little bit of political history in there that I think is pretty interesting, okay, to follow. But not everything that's scandalous is a downer. Not everything that's scandalous is serious. I mean, some of it's just downright funny. And I have to go back just for a moment to the baseball. I do love the stories, and I stuck mostly with the early baseball because it's just so funny. There was this German immigrant who was, there's this German Solar community in the South, but then was also a sort of north side German community. And he had a bar, and he was so out of touch with American traditions that he couldn't figure out why in the summer his bar would empty out for 2-3 hours at a time. I mean, where did all these people go? They were drinking just a moment ago, and now they've left. And then they'd all come roaring back in. And he couldn't figure out what was going on with this. And finally, someone explained to him the whole idea of baseball. And there was a baseball game going on right down the street, down at Vanderbilt and Grand. And finally, someone said, it'd be such a neat thing if you could take some of your beer and sell it at the game. But he couldn't, because the people that owned the team at the time, and this was the St. Louis Brown Stockings, not to be confused with the St. Louis Browns. This is actually the team that went ahead and became the Cardinals. And he said, well, but those people are dries. And I think Prohibition has, sort of lost its sting for us. But there was a time when people argued Prohibition. It wasn't the law of the land yet. That didn't happen until 1920. This is back in the 1880s. Okay? And what's going on is that there was local option prohibition, which meant you could favor prohibition and your neighbor could be really opposed to it, and people debated in the streets. It's hard to even come up with an issue. Perhaps the abortion issue is as fraught today, but I mean, people fought about this all the time. Okay? And so the people that owned the St. Louis Brown Stockings were dries. And so this German immigrant named Chris Vander decides he wants to sell his beer, so he goes out and buys the team. And suddenly he cuts the price in half so that, regular people can attend. He has beer. He has some property nearby, and we picture, at Wrigley, the houses across the street where people are watching the game. But they were doing that early on in St. Louis because Chris Vanderall owned the houses nearby, and he was such a character. I mean, he just didn't understand baseball at all. He would lead the team in a parade every game. He would lead the team in. He would have on his top hat and his frock coat and his matching greyhounds. Okay? And he would lead the team into the stadium for every game. He did things like, at one point he was actually watching the game, which was rare apparently, and he saw, and the team won the game on a single right field. So he sends down one of his famous edicts that says, hereafter, hit all balls to right field. I mean, he just had no idea what the game was about. But he did do one thing right, and that was to hire Charlie Comiskey as first a player and then a player manager. And I know people today hear the name Comiskey and they think about a ballpark on the south side of Chicago. But Charlie Comiskey played in St. Louis before that and was both brilliant and profane and scandalous. And I was watching a game this past summer, the Cardinals game on TV. We do get those in Virginia. And I'm watching the game, and Dan McLaughlin and Rick Horton said, I wonder when coaches' boxes came along. And if I'd been good at social media, I'd have been on it telling the story that's in the book, okay, about coaches' boxes. It happens that Charlie Comiskey, and by the way, this is the team that invented trash talk. Apparently there was a time when players just played the game and didn't have much to say about it, but not the Brown Stockings. They were loud and insulting and scandalous at the time. But Comiskey and one of his fellow players would be the third base and the first base coach when they weren't on base themselves. And they would get right on either side of the opposing catcher. And you can imagine the things they were saying, insults about man's genealogy and his skill and all that sort of thing. And they were so outrageous about it. I mean, these things just weren't done back then, that the association decided we're going to draw little coaches' boxes, okay, down by first and third base and make them stay in them. I don't know that they stayed in them any better than coaches do now, but that's an innovation that if you're a baseball fan, oh, cool. All of that came out of St. Louis, okay, because at the time, the way St. Louis played the game was scandalous. And that's a fun one.
Can you name a baseball player whose autographed picture is worth more than Babe Ruth's? I can. It's a person who only had one at bat in his entire major league career. And he walked.
If I were going to guess who that is, and I've just lost his name, from Milwaukee. Oh, lost his name. Okay, but so your story. Tell me, Fedora. Tell me, Fedora. Who would that be?
It's Eddie Geidel. Why? Because he was 3 feet 7 inches tall.
Oh yeah. I remember that story. Yeah.
And Bill Beck in 1951 sneaked him into a game. This is about the real St. Louis Browns from later on, who weren't a very good team. They lost about twice as much as they won.
Absolutely.
But at any rate, this particular game was an anniversary of Falstaff, and they were serving free beer, but he still couldn't get enough people to fill the stadium. And so he did this entire stunt, which got him immense publicity and immense scandal, to have a very frightened dwarf at bat.
Yes, I do remember that one. The I do take out after some other baseball stories that happened later on. Rogers Hornsby, of course, was a great baseball player, but during his second stint in St. Louis, when he was player manager for the Browns, his gambling thing got to be a real issue. And the owners finally hired the Pinkertons to suss out what the man was doing instead of sort of managing. And that all, I think, ended about 1937 with Hornsby losing his job. And I couldn't resist. I just absolutely couldn't resist just throwing in a little bit about Augie Busch and Harry Carey. And I know it was after 1950, but the editors looked the other way. So there are a few stories like that come along in the 20th century instead of the 19th century. But I had fun with the baseball stories. Some of the stories are not fun. I mean, the stories of slavery before the Civil War are not fun. Even the stories of governmental corruption. And one of the things, you read that a lot, that St. Louis was known nationally for its corruption. Even though you don't hear Tweed or Pendergast, there was certainly a man named Ed Butler who was every bit as effective. But one of the things that I was interested in that I found was about the gangs that supported Ed Butler's efforts. I mean, you just don't say vote for somebody. You have to have some muscle behind it. And St. Louis had its Egan's Rats and other really nasty gangs that supported the politics. Okay? So that was not a happy story. Although a hero came out of that, as those of you who know St. Louis history know, a man named Joe Folk. Okay, who was elected, and everyone thought, oh, he'll just go along like everybody else. He was elected to be a prosecuting attorney, and he actually went after the corrupt. And that's a fascinating story, too. And then, of course, there's a story that, there's a lot of books out there that have little things about and big things about St. Louis history. And one of them is always the shooting at the Post-Dispatch. And I'm sure people have heard about that one. A man who objected to the Post-Dispatch's political stance went in to complain about it, and whether or not, he got around to drawing his gun or what the situation was, he ended up being shot and killed by the managing editor of the Post-Dispatch, which created quite a public hullabaloo. But what I wanted to add to that story was how reminiscent it is of some of the things that we see happening today in the media. There were a bunch of newspapers in St. Louis. Obviously, that was the only press at the time. This is in 1882. But the three big newspapers, one of them was very conservative. In fact, it was the one that if you had been a Southern sympathizer, the Civil War not being very long before that, that's the one you went for. The Post-Dispatch is on the other end of the spectrum and is the muckraker. I mean, they are the ones who are taking up every public cause and going after it. And in between, there is the old Globe Democrat. And you have to be an older member of the audience to remember the Globe Democrat. But it used to be the morning newspaper when the Post-Dispatch was the afternoon newspaper. And it had a position sort of in between the other two. And back in the day, these people sniped at each other every day. I mean, we think the media now has, staked out political positions, but that was true at the time as well. In fact, one society woman wrote and said that, I think she wrote to her brother and said, we hate it that Alonzo Slayback, the man who was killed, died, but if his dying means that we can get rid of that scurrilous sheet called the Post-Dispatch, the city will be so much better. And of course, we all know that the Post-Dispatch is the one that survived. But there were the media back then were very different, but almost, at least the editor of the Globe Democrat had a great sense of humor. And I love finding the things that he wrote, more of a sense of humor than the papers on the other side of him. So that's a little bit of context that doesn't always go along with that story of the shooting.
Well, I think we have to have a gangster story or two. my favorite one is 1926. One of the gangs had a basement bar in a building right next to the St. Louis City Central Library. It's a parking lot now, but then it had a bar in the basement. And they were listening to the Dempsey-Tunney fight on radio. An amazing thing then. Radio was only 5 years old in St. Louis, and a radio cost $200. You could get 3 acres of ground for $200. So they were there listening to the fight. Dempsey won. Dempsey lost, by the way, to Tunney. And in comes a bunch of people shooting the place up and destroying it, because that was the favorite pastime of the gangs in St. Louis. I took a wonderful Missouri history bus ride, and they pointed out street corners where the police fought against Hogan's Rats or Jelly Roll Hortons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was just amazing. I hope they have some more of those. Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. I really wish I had gotten some more in there. And most of my gang stories have to do with politics and, of course, bars. We forget that, there was a day when on their way home, every working man had his bar that he stopped in. I mean, they didn't go directly home. They stopped in their bar. And therefore, those bars became political centers. You've got all these people, all these guys around talking what went on during the day, talking politics, and an astute bar owner was very capable of creating his own little political machine, out of his bar. And that's certainly what happened with a lot of the less savory political situations in St. Louis. I mean, they were bar-based, and the gangs grew out of that. So
it was a great place for people to get reinforced inside in order to go and vote someplace else, because they voted several times.
Oh, absolutely. But Ed Butler, I mentioned, was the boss in St. Louis, and his poll workers, which are politely called, were called Butler's Indians, because the first thing he did in his career was he took trainloads of men to Indianapolis. He went someplace else to perfect his technique, and just ran the guys ragged. I mean, they'd vote like 10 times during the day at various precincts. And then he brought them all back to St. Louis and said, okay, that was good training. We can do that in St. Louis too. So Butler's Indians were the voting crew.
Aren't we glad that we now have all kinds of safeguards, having people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, that when any vote comes in, we have all kinds of safeguards that are right now in place. And it gives me a lot of confidence in our system of voting.
Well, yes, there were certainly issues. One of the things that we talk about a lot is Bloody Island and the fights, the duels that men would engage in on Bloody Island. And a lot of those started at the polls, I mean, it was because things were not as well controlled, and an election judge could slow things down by checking everybody's papers and taking a lot of time. So it was impossible for everybody who wanted to vote to actually do so. And when people started trading insults, those sometimes led to the, quote, field of honor, which was on Bloody Island, which was a towhead, a little sandbar off of St. Louis that later got moved over to the Illinois side. And who did that? Robert E. Lee. And I knew he was an engineer, but I didn't realize his work in moving the towhead that was blocking the wharves in St. Louis over to the Illinois side, which essentially, took care of commerce and but it did move away the political grounds for fighting. So interesting stories.
Oh, Shane is back with us. What do you got for us, Shane?
First off, thank you so much for this frequently very funny conversation. It's sometimes really great to laugh about crime, and sometimes just kind of horrifying to think about how
Absolutely.
terrifying the city was at this time. So I'm
But
really,
we survived it, so that's good.
well, some people did.
Well, yeah.
Some people didn't. We have a lot of really great questions. I want to remind the audience watching that first off, you can buy a copy of the book at left-bank.com. We are super happy to be able to present this event, and part of the reason that we are able to continue bringing you such incredible authors is through your support of buying books. So if you are so inclined and would love to have a copy of this fantastic book for your bookshelf, it is available on our shelves right now. And I would also like to thank Fedora for representing St. Louis Sisters in Crime, I just love the sisters, and also the St. Charles City County Library for co-presenting with us tonight. So let's start with a question from Elizabeth. This is probably for both of you, but so Elizabeth is asking, what advice do you have for aspiring writers?
Wow. I think it's worth saying, first of all, that writing is hard work. It really, really is. And both Fedora and I write historical stuff. And writing history, historical fiction, historical nonfiction, is a lot of work. Okay. And I spent all morning trying to figure out how long it would take a barge to get from Rotterdam to Liège, Belgium, because I'm writing a World War I thing. But I guess I want to say it's a lot of work, but it's worth it. Okay. So the advice is stay with it. It makes the world a better place, and it makes you a better person, I think, to write. It really does, because you have to think through so many things, and then you get to put them on the page, and make other people think. And thinking is good. So I guess my advice is figure out what you want to do, work hard at it, but stick with it, regardless of what you think the results. I mean, don't get too easily discouraged, is my advice.
Yeah, write the damn thing. That's the first thing. But second, if it's a spy book, don't tell too much. Dribble a little at a time.
I am not a writer, but frequently this comes up in conversations. And the best piece of advice that I think I've heard is to write the book that you want, because you're going to be the one reading it more than literally anyone else. And you need to make sure that it is the book that you want to exist in the world, because you're going to be the primary reader. And if you don't want to read the book, no one else will want to read the book.
And it will be the focus of your life, maybe for 2 or 3 years. And if you get bored with it, readers will get bored with it. So that is great advice, to make sure it's something you're passionate about.
Yeah. And frequently authors say, like, don't think about the audience when you're writing a book. Like, people will read books, like, almost on any topic, literally any topic. So just write a book for you, and then you will find the readers for it.
Yeah. Sometimes that comes out as don't write for the market.
Yeah.
Everybody's writing about zombies, but you don't have to write about zombies, because the market will have moved on probably by the time you get that book out there. So, write what you're interested in, not for the market. Yeah, that's important, I think.
Sarah Lynn says...
And by the way, good luck, Elizabeth.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know who Elizabeth is, but good luck to you if you're writing.
Sarah Lynn asks, Joe, for your historical mysteries, how do you research what the lives of women in St. Louis were like during the early 1900s? And to be completely clear, I did share the link. So the link is up there, and I'm going to find that again. So I'll reshare that as you answer the question.
Thank you. I think the link that Shane's referring to is, in addition to my author website, I maintain a website called 1910 St. Louis by J. Allison. Actually, it says Joe Allison there. No, it says J. Allison. And because I realized I had learned so much in writing my books about what people wore and what kind of music they were able to listen to, and how they got across town, and what 20-somethings were like in 1910, and all of that is on that website. But the answer is research and research and more research. When I started doing this, as I say, I didn't live in St. Louis when I started doing this. We were driving through town at least twice a year to get down to Joplin, where we still had elderly parents. And so we would go see them twice a year. And every time I went through town, I would spend an afternoon in the library. Okay. Sometimes I would go to the public library downstairs. And back then, this is before they remodeled, down in a little small spot in a basement, there were microfilm, and I would dig out newspapers and read about what everybody was doing, but what women were doing in particular. And then I would go out to the Western Historical Manuscript Collection, and I would go through the files of people like Anna Gellhorn, these women that made such a difference. And I would read all that background. And most of all, I would go to the wonderful resource that is the Missouri Historical Society Research Library on Skinker. I have spent hours there. I have a wonderful map. As you walk in, I don't know if it's still there. As you walk in, there is a map on the wall that's 1915 St. Louis. And I think it's a recreation. It's where the parks are and everything. Okay? And those wonderful people found the original of that map. They couldn't copy more than an 8x10 piece. So I go back home with all these 18 or 8x10 pieces and tape them together, so I can learn the city. And on it, I marked every streetcar route, all of that sort of thing, because it's the minutia that you need to learn about. Pick up an old city directory, and mostly it will tell you what the men are doing. But if you dig for it, you'll also find out what the women were doing. And so that's without libraries. That's why I'm so excited that the St. Charles City County Library is with us tonight. Librarians are just the answer. Okay. And almost all of them love to talk to you about this stuff. So if you want to know what women were doing, go ask a librarian. That's the short answer.
I think Joe is absolutely right. It is those little details that make all the difference, like what kind of foods they had and what you could buy for how much money in the advertisements in newspapers. And I too have a map from the same place. Mine is from 1897.
Yes. Fedora's writing's maybe not quite a generation, but ahead of mine. Yeah, she writes late 19th century. I write early 20th century.
Yeah, mine is Gilded Age, and yours is like the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Before we get to Lloyd's question, I want to ask my question. So out of all the periods covered in the book, if you had to spend one day, this is for both of you, one day in one of those years, what would it be and why?
I would go to 1916 and be in that Golden Lane. I'd be at the Golden Lane, no problem.
That's easy. And I might go for 1920 once they got the vote and made all that difference, and then had to deal with the really hard questions of, do we keep pushing as women, or do we become Republicans, Democrats, labor activists? That is a fascinating dilemma. But the other thing is, of course, my background is as a news reporter, and I would like to have been one of the first women news reporters, in St. Louis. That would have been fun. Dangerous, maybe, but fun.
All right. Lloyd is asking, what various sources did you use for your music-related pieces, and were they unique to that research?
No, they really weren't terribly unique to me, because there is a wonderful resource out there. Let's see how quickly I can find his name. His last name is Berlin, who has written so well about Scott Joplin. Okay, he left no stone unturned. We know everything we know about Scott Joplin because of his work. So I have read that. I read that many years ago, went back and found it. And Edward Berlin, detailed biography, King of Ragtime. But one thing that I did add, okay, and this is a book that I know you have on your shelves, Walter Johnson, In the Broken Heart of America, wrote about Scott Joplin. And in that distinctive way that Johnson has. He just put he put a lot of that in there, and in his book about the basic unfairness of the situation. And I picked up some quotes from him, and so they're a real counterpoint to the Berlin work that is pretty happy about the whole ragtime era, but it wasn't necessarily always happy. So I think my contribution was to tie those together. But and then of course when I said that Scott Joplin, I don't know, many people assume that he was just a wonderful pianist because he was a brilliant man and a brilliant musician, but he actually had to take lessons as a grown man. I mean, as a man writing these wonderful ragtime pieces, he had to go take lessons to play some of them. And the other sports, that were in Tom Turpin's cutting contest used to make fun of him because he wasn't a great pianist. So I guess I put that one in because I still I think, Maple Leaf Rag is one of the hardest things I've ever played in my life. And I was pretty good at it when I was 12, and I've just gotten worse since then. So I do have that personal perspective on it that I can sympathize with Scott Joplin trying to play some of the things he wrote.
So I know that based on your research, there has to be a lot of stories that were not included in this book.
Right.
Do you imagine that there's going to be a volume 2?
It would be nice if Glove Pequot Press would be interested in doing that. They haven't done it with any of the other books yet, but who knows? Maybe we can come up with the first one, because as I say, they wanted, I think, 70,000 words. And by the time I was pushing 90,000, they said, this is wonderful, but just we could have done outtakes from this book and had a second volume. So that would have been nice.
If enough people buy the book, hint, hint, people watching,
Yes.
then maybe Globe Pequot will greenlight it. So
That's exactly how you convince a publisher of anything. So,
yep. Well, I don't see any other questions from the audience, but I've just had a lovely time. I, like many people watching, probably, I won't assume why people are watching, but I'm very interested in true crime. I think it reveals a side of human nature that is very interesting and can oftentimes show you the lighter side of human nature as well, because for every crime, there's always someone that is solving the crime, and for like putting people away, and like, so there's always that kind of balance of, with especially historical true crime, that you can see like a side of humans that show that there isn't always something going wrong, that sometimes there are people doing the right thing. So that's part of the reason why I love reading and watching true crime and listening to. So I want to thank you for writing an incredibly interesting book that I'm certain everyone is going to love.
Cool. Thank you. It was fun.
All right, I'm going to share the link again for how you can get a copy of Storied and Scandalous St. Louis, A History of Breweries, Baseball, Prejudice, and Protest. But also you can order a copy of The Good Old Summertime, the historical fiction from Joe Allison, which is soon to be on our shelves now. So it'll be up there and ready to order this evening. And we are so happy to have both of you here tonight, as well as our wonderful partners with the St. Charles City County Library, who are always fantastic to work with.
Absolutely.
And most importantly, thank you to everyone watching. You have been delightful, and we are happy to see you. Be sure to tune in for some of our other virtual events as well. So thanks. All right, bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jane. Thank you, Fedora.